you have a document called Understanding, what did I call it this time? Understanding Societies and Historical Change. And this is a way of building upon our work with the fundamental needs. So if we want to think of the children as layering their understanding from the time they're 6 and coming into the class, their first impression of human history is about the gifts of the human being, which are the heart, the mind, and the hand. Okay? And another very early impression is that all humans have needs, and those needs are the same, whether or not you live in South America, in Europe, in North America, Asia, Africa, Australia, whatever. So imagine you're 6. You know, this is a big discovery, that human beings have gifts that every single human being has been given, that they have needs which every other human has. And then the second part about it is that they use their gifts to satisfy their needs in one way, or what? How many ways do human beings have to satisfy their needs? Almost as many as there are people. But that groups of people get in agreement on, we'll do it this way. Right? And what affects that? What affects that decision? Where they live, the geography, the biology, the ecology of the place. And then, because human beings also create, they don't just respond to their environment, then the things that they create also start to inform or direct the way that they satisfy their needs. And they start to do things just because that's the way we've always done them. And they don't think about it anymore as a problem solving. It's just the way we do things. And we don't really know why. And sometime way back there maybe have been a reason, but now we just do it. And that's culture. All the sum of the things, the way that we do things that we don't really think about. And when does culture get absorbed by the child? In those first 6 years, yeah? The child by 6 is a member of their culture and has some beliefs, has some prejudices, has some filters with which they're going to then meet the world. So when your children come into your class at 6, they already think that there's really mostly our way of doing things. So to open them up to the human experience of that, yes, there's your way, and there's many, many other ways, is a big revelation for them. It's a big discovery. And we do that through our fundamental needs stories, the charts. We do it through then also taking a look at everyday objects and thinking that, you know, before there were bridges, there were no bridges. Before there was a phone, there was no phone. And what was that like? So when the child is 6 and their imagination and their reason is kind of exploding in all directions, we have to harness that energy and start to get them to imagine, what was it like before this thing happened, before this invention was made? And that is your storytelling challenge, is to strip the child of what they take for granted. So whenever you're talking about inventions, it's not enough just to say, this was invented. Because the children, well, so what? I use it, you know, now I just use it. I don't really care what was invented. But in Montessori, we need to create a connection between the children of today and those people who did invent these things for the first time. And it has to happen through the storytelling medium. So when you're working with 6 to 7-year-olds, most of your history work is really about the fundamental needs. And it's story-based, and it's taking a look at the objects of everyday life and saying, at one point these were not here. Let's go back and take a look at that. And let's explore, what was the problem? What was the dilemma that caused these people to feel the need to create something? And with our children today, this is more important than ever, because the people of earlier times had to be creative. They had to. It was a survival issue. It wasn't about expressing yourself. It was about making sure that your tribe made it through the winter. So you got creative out of need. Very few children in modern society sense that need. Even poor children don't sense that need, because for some reason, you know, they don't have to produce the food themselves. They still press the button and the light goes on. They don't have to invent electricity. They might hear about the problems with the buying and selling of things, but they don't themselves see adults around them creating the things that make life possible. They just see us consuming and using things. So we have to then find that basic creativity of the human being, the human potential. We have to dig it out of the children in a way that no one has ever had to do before. So our stories have to be more engaging, because we don't have need and to help us of just, we just got to do it. Now we have to actually choose to do it, which is a very big challenge for parents and educators. So our storytelling with the 6s and 7s really bases itself on the fact that regardless of whether you can open that refrigerator and get food, food is still a need that someone had to work for to get it into that refrigerator. And it wasn't just your mom who had to go out to work and buy the money. There's also a chain of work that might travel around the whole world to make sure that that bread is there, or that meal is on the table. But when the children get to be around 8, we have to start to bring something else into the picture. We have to start helping the children to see that needs are not just by themselves. Like, we don't have the need for transport over here, the need for food over here, the need for clothing. That the way in which a group satisfies needs makes those needs come together in a network of need and a network of creativity, which then we call a society. And that society is more than just the sum of everybody fixing and making satisfying their needs. Because it involves everybody doing, in some ways, more than just their own thing. Everybody just doing their own thing to satisfy their needs does not a society make. And the analogy would be, in the classroom, if you have a rule that everybody cleans up after themselves and everybody does their classroom job, within a couple of weeks, your classroom will be a disaster. Even though everybody is cleaning up after even if everybody is perfectly good at cleaning up after themselves and doing their classroom job. And the classroom falls apart because, for one, we're not always aware when we're making a mess, right? So that pencil that falls down, I don't clean it up because I didn't notice that it's down there. Somebody else comes by and kicks it because it's not theirs. And it remains on the floor, right? So what makes the actual classroom work? Not that everybody cleans up after themselves or does their own job, but that everybody cleans up after themselves, everybody does their classroom job, and everybody does more. Everybody pays attention to other people's messes and needs and cleans up after each other and doesn't worry about it, because if I clean up after you, you'll clean up after me, somebody else will clean up after us, and the pencils will get off of the floor. And nobody will be talking about how, well, that wasn't mine. So that's really a society, isn't it? Where what you do for your own benefit, you have to do more than that, or you have to do something for the group as a whole. You cannot just be satisfying your own needs. And this is where the children, especially in the second half of the lower elementary and throughout the upper elementary, need to start focusing, is this larger idea of society. And that whenever human beings then share that, they're creating webs of interdependence, just like an ecosystem. And there are no small parts to play in that. And we have some very good things that we can bring to the children in this exploration. And I like to call it that we're actually doing the archaeology of the human tendencies. If you go back and think about, we have our gifts, our heart, our hand, and our mind. And then we have these superpowers: exploration, orientation, order, abstraction. Those are superpowers that human beings have used to make the heart, hand, and mind work together to create. So we started off, we came with needs, We had our gifts. And then we had all of these superpowers. And every child in your class has those superpowers. Do they know about them? They need to know about them. Huh? Our theory work with human tendencies is not something that you keep just in your head. It's something you bring. When you talk about the timeline of first human beings, what are you talking about? You're talking about the gifts, and you're talking about what did people have to do with their superpowers in that time when they didn't have roads, they didn't have electronics, and how did they create a world? And if they hadn't have done it, if they hadn't have used those, would we even be here? And that's the real question to keep in the children's minds, is that they are absolutely dependent on the work of all of these people that have gone before them. So in your storytelling of inventions, of people, of time periods, these are what you have to, they're kind of like your, what's it called, the stillage, the scaffolding of your storytelling. It doesn't mean you have to talk about all of them all of the time, but they are the scaffolding that you use to say, all right, where's the hook in the story that will help the children see how this invention was made, how this change in society came about. So they have their needs, they have their gifts, they have their superpowers, and what do they do with them? They're driven to create. And that sopra-natura is the legacy that every generation gives to the next generation. So it involves the inventions and the tools and the beliefs. They're also part of the sopra-natura. Beliefs don't just come out of nowhere, right? The customs that we have. Why do we have customs? Why do we shake hands when we greet? Why do some people, kiss on one cheek, and then some kiss two, and some kiss three, and some people put their hands together to greet. Some people bow. What's all that about? What is that greeting custom about in terms of human society?
It depends, doesn't it? I mean,
what's it for?
Acknowledge, yeah.
What does it acknowledge?
That you're alive, that you're here.
Yeah. If I greet you,
Yeah, I mean, it depends. I think it's something.
perhaps, yeah. There's a respect there. Yeah. When we stop to greet somebody, there's a respect that there's an other, and then there's me.
And maybe a third.
And maybe more than that. And that we are somehow participating in something together. We are going to perhaps talk, and that it's the grease of the human relationships, yeah? If you think about the animal world, they have ways to, meet and greet. They sniff, they pee on each other. They do weird. They do things that mark territory, or that they use their senses to sort of create a kind of a respectful boundary between oneself and the other. And human beings have customs that, if we woke up every day and had to recreate all of those things, the world would be very scary. Just even knowing that I can walk up to somebody and shake their hand and greet, that gives me an in. And if you see children who don't know those simple customs, you see how uncomfortable they get. And sometimes our Montessori children are really admired because we've taught them how to, a simple thing like meeting and greeting. So if they go on a trip, they go up to somebody and they thank the bus driver, or they do something that gives the indication that I want to be in your good graces, and I want to be welcomed in this world. Those are things that if you don't have them, that you feel very, very uncomfortable in the world. So that's part of our sopra natura. And then we have physical structures. We have buildings, we have roads, we have anything that houses all of the stuff that we've created. And that has its own, that is its own legacy, the way we build things. So what happens, what's the backdrop, what's the scenery for when there's a change in society? What do we have to look at? What do we have to help the children see in their minds? Well, we have to help them see that that change happens because of some challenge or need or dilemma that needed to be resolved. Then the human beings in that situation had to look around and say, what do we have to work with? What are our resources with which to try to solve this dilemma? And then there's ideas. Where do ideas come from? They're magic, yeah? I had this little boy who is 7, and we were talking about the Holy Spirit in Christianity, and he's like, I know that the Holy Spirit is. And he said, because when I go to bed at night, I just get these ideas. And where do they come from? They must be the Holy Spirit, because for him it was magical. Yeah, they just popped into his head. So where do ideas come from? Where does plan B come from if plan A doesn't work? That's something that sometimes we know who had the ideas and sometimes we don't. And that's what we have to help the children understand. And then there's the skill sets. What do we have to be able to do with the resources and the ideas so that we can solve the problem? And then we actually have to do it, the work. We have to put in the work. And then, for it to not be just a flash in the pan, we have to communicate that so that this gets, this continues to maybe a new place or a new generation. And then we have to live with the consequences, positive and negative, and every change might bring about some new risks and new problems that we have to deal with. So in your storytelling, this is classic fairy tale, isn't it? So this should help you in your storytelling to create the characters and their dilemmas and problems, to create a setting. This is what the resources were, this is what the skill sets of these people had, and then this is what they did. This is how they met that challenge, and this is what they came up with, and then it came to us over time. And a lot of what we want to bring to the children is this idea that human beings are tool users par excellence. Not that other animals don't use tools, but we have really taken off with the whole tool thing. And not all children are aware of what a tool is. And a tool could be a lot of different things. But what, in essence, they are extensions of our hands and our minds and our hearts. They are the ways in which we make ourselves bigger than what we would be. A lever allows us to lift something that we wouldn't be able to lift with our hands. A pulley allows us to work together to also, again, do something that we could not do by ourselves. A pencil allows us to communicate something to people who are not standing right in front of us. So all of these things are the tools with which we transform our world. And the children are surrounded by them, and it's very important that we bring their attention to those tools and where they came from. Boy, this doesn't really like to. Come on. So, here's where you're all going to work a little bit. Society in general, culture in general, has gone through some major transformations. But they're not really linear, like first everybody was a hunter-gatherer, and then everybody did agriculture, and then everybody lived in cities, and then everybody did the Industrial Revolution, and so on. It's more like concentric circles where there's a new layer of activity layered on what has been going on before. It's like a little bit like evolution. Evolution is always tinkering with what is already there. And so we can look at societal change not as a progression towards like that the modern industrial society or the post-industrial society is the pinnacle of human achievement, but that every web that's created then creates problems that then other things come in and help. But let's think about hunting and gathering peoples, because we all are there. And that's the other thing, is that we are biologically still there in many ways. That's where our tendencies were created to solve these problems, right? Nature did not know that we would live in the age of computers, I don't think anyway, right? But we came to Earth in this situation. So our tendencies, our exploration, our orientation is biologically designed for a hunter-gatherer way of life. So at your tables, I want you to think about then the setting of, what were the resources? What did people who came first on Earth, what did they have to know about? What were the skill sets that you had to develop as a child to be able to make it as a hunter-gatherer? Right? I'll give you about 10 minutes. Just type. Because if we want to bring the hunting-gathering way of life to the children with respect, we have to connect it to something very deep in both the children and in humanity. So you have to think, what were they very clever about? Okay? So we'll have 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll share some of those things, and I will write them in. And I'm going to write down some of your notes. Let's start with this table here. How do you be a hunter-gatherer? What do you have to know? What do you have to be able to do to be good at it?
All right, ready?
I'm ready.
So you're said somebody to be physically fit.
Okay.
They have to nourish their bodies. They have to also be mentally fit.
In what way? They had to be pretty robust in the sense of like not letting things get them down, yeah? Because you might go out all day and not find anything, and you couldn't go, oh man, you know, and
They had to stay sharp.
yeah.
Mentally sharp.
Men-
Mentally sharp.
Okay.
They had to have a connection with the world around them. They used their senses, instincts, and memory. And we talked a lot about them being risk takers. Again, I think that ties into being sharp. And okay, so this might not have worked, so let's not have any fear about trying this. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
To make improvements. Support one another, and they had to be very good observers, and that's tied in to help their memory.
Okay, let's move to another table, and if you have something to add on, just add on. And I'm writing all these things down, so when you have the PDF, you'll have everybody's stuff, yeah? Anything that they didn't say that you want to add on?
We talked about the initial drive that's in them when we talked a lot about in primary how the children like to work. So they want to keep going when they're hunting. They want to keep working, right?
Okay, so they can't be afraid of hard work, right?
We said a lot of what you said.
We kind of like our discussions first started off by naming very concrete, specific things, like similar that they needed to be in good health and have good senses. And then we started saying things like, oh, well, people needed to be aware of cycles. Cycles in nature, of reactions or things that occurred, like cause and effect relationships. So we started off with these, like, we kind of moved from part to whole, and then the more we talked, we kind of realized that we also brought up the list of the tendencies, that all of the things that we were actually naming were the tendencies.
Exactly.
So, so we distilled it down to saying, and then perhaps, I mean, I don't know if this is what you're looking for, but basically, like all of the things that, you know, exploration, curiosity, the orientation of the cycles in nature, and ordering the reactions of human beings with interacting with nature or plants and animals.
Let's think about that orientation thing, and being observant. Okay. A hunter-gatherer doesn't have to be observant in the same way that we would have to be observant. So what is it that they're observing? Okay, so now we can just sort of like throw out some things. So because that's important to bring to the children, that what did you have to observe? Not just that you were good at it, but what did you have to be good at observing?
So if you went somewhere, you had to find your way back.
Okay. No signs, right? So you had to be really aware of the physical features of the landscape, because they were your only markers. Yeah, physical features of the landscape. Okay, what about other things that you had to be able to observe? Yeah.
Oriented to the passing of the days and the seasons in order to plan, you know, where the food was going to be and if you were going to be able to make it back to shelter of a day.
Okay, so in terms of gathering, you had to be observant about when and where plants bloomed or were available for gathering. When did those berries come out? And those were different from those other berries. So, and you had to have, in a way, an encyclopedia of berries in your head, knowing exactly when in the cycle you could pick and things, because you don't want to miss out on those important nutrients. So you had to be very aware of the cycles of plant life. And of animals. When do they come to the watering hole? When do they go to the new feeding grounds? The movements of the animals. And what about the character of the animals?
Yeah, we said like what you can hunt and then also how to prepare it.
Huh. Okay, so they have to know about the behavior, because you have to know, do you sneak in this way? Do you Do you attack from the front? Do you attack from the side? Do you take them at night? Do you take them at day? Do you take them at dusk? And then all the sort of then, how do you prepare the food? Remember, you've got no refrigerator. So,
And also, if what you're hunting is even nutritious, is it worth it? Like
Ah.
that ordering of the mind too, in terms of, is this even, is this even going to sustain us if we put all this effort into it?
That's
And
like
that actually
positive
goes
effects
into,
of like, how does it affect your body or something.
right, and then it goes into communication
Yeah.
because you pass that on, right? So you don't waste your time doing it again.
How many calories will we have to spend to catch a cheetah? And how many calories will we get by eating that cheetah as opposed to a water buffalo?
How many points does it choose?
How many?
And what's the relative level of danger? Which one?
what about their relation to water? Water is a fundamental need. Do they have to be observant about water and where they camp, how to store water if you're moving? What did they use to store water?
Animal skin?
Animal skin, often the stomach
Yeah.
of the animal,
Gourds.
or
Gourds.
gourds, ostrich eggs, and if you were in Africa, they could use to store water. They had storage of water, and the portableness of water was an important thing that they had to know a lot about. How to find water, and how to store it, and how to carry it. What about fire? Did anybody talk about fire in their groups?
Yeah. How to make it, what burns.
How to carry it.
How to make fire, what burns well, how to control it, how to again transport it. A lot of times you take embers, wrap them up in leaves to carry it, and then they're still glowing by the time you get to the new place. So there's all these techniques so that you didn't necessarily have to start from scratch every time. Okay. So we've got food. We have this idea of the social network of a hunter-gatherer group. What kind of cooperation? A lot of sharing, right? Often the hunter-gatherer societies are quite egalitarian in that there's not necessarily always one person who decides, that you have to be much more sharing about both your resources. Often if somebody gets something, that it's shared to everybody. As opposed to everybody fends for themselves. So it's often very, the idea of cooperation, sharing, and distribution of resources. They had to be quite good at that. Yeah.
I'm just curious, about how big were these societies and when they moved?
That's a good question. Could they be very big? Now, I think they usually think about them as being like 150, 200 maybe. I'm not 100% sure I'm accurate on that, but that's sort of a number that's floating around in my head.
Going back to communication too, even within the context of coordinating movement too. So if you're hunting, you're not going to go out. Usually they don't go out by themselves, right? They hunt in parties, and so they have to communicate with one another what each individual specialization is, what everyone's job is in that particular field.
So there has to be a very strong division of labor, and yet at the same time, everybody has to watch out for themselves. What's this starting to sound like? Perhaps an elementary classroom.
Also, developing the skill of silence and self-control.
What was that?
Silence and self-control.
Yeah.
that notion of being able to track. If you have to track animals, you have to know how to do it silently. And then you have to know when to make noise and when not to make noise.
But also as it relates to communication and being around others, I mean, to override the impulse to get angry at your other hunter-gatherers and to not spaz out on them.
Yeah, you can't go anywhere,
Yeah.
right? You know, you're kind of stuck with these people, right? So you actually just have to get on with it. So perhaps there's certain level of coordination of just the way that you have to be in order to make this kind of thing work. So we have some really good skills there. What about how they teach the next generation? Books?
Oral history.
A lot of oral history, right? So you have to be a good storyteller, because that's how you continue your culture. And they have to be good at showing things, because you can't say, oh, well, read the book on it, read the instruction manual. You have to show. Everything has to be shown. Well, what do we do in our primary classes? We show. Yeah? And what do we want to do with children in terms of the writing process? We want to get them to show with words, not just tell with words. So we're not that far off. We're just not using those things for the same ends, but we still have this in us. Okay, so we have some really good stuff there. And I'm going to save that. And I'm sure then you can then just take whatever I've been able to cut down and put in whatever you also have if you have some more things. So let's think then about early pastoralism. Okay, around 10,000 BC, humans started developing a new kind of relationship with animals. Okay? So how did that happen? We talked about how they had to take all that information that they had been building up about animal movements, about animal behavior, about where animals were, what they did, and somehow someone was able to then create a new kind of relationship with animals through domestication. But there were some new challenges then about if you're going to have domesticated animals. I want you to then think with your groups, okay, just with that, just if you're going to have some sheep or some goats, so what's new? What's going to be the new challenges you have to meet in your life? So you got 5 minutes for that.
Or figure out where they
Right. Have to deal with possibly conflict. Not only predators, but yeah, also other groups. Are you guys on the same document before? I do. I'm doing everything for everybody. So what are we adding now? What protection? What new challenges does the domestic animals bring? Protect them, feed them.
Now, we're thinking about animal husbandry and the new skills layered on the old skills, because the old skills didn't disappear exactly, but new challenges and new skills. So what have you guys got in terms of the early pastoralists, your group? Yeah.
Big one is that really you have to learn to observe new things about animals.
Like what?
Their health, understanding their reproductive patterns and life cycles, how the animals would care for their young. You would need more, I said you need more of pretty much everything. You need more space, you need more food, you need more water, to be able to provide all of those for the animals and for the humans. To figure out how to provide winter food for the animals. Figuring out how to protect the animals from predators.
So, and what are you thinking? Tools for what?
For new needs, for structures, for fences, containment, pertaining to living.
Okay, so you want, maybe you have to make a pen, or you have to, and so then this is leading to a slightly more sedentary lifestyle. Even if you are a herder and you're going to move to new pastures after a time, you're going to stay settled longer, which creates issues. But in this relationship of learning more about the animals, their reproduction, their care for their young, what role now is the human?
That's what we talked about, the shift. There's a huge shift that occurs where you're not just responding to your own needs, you're responding to your needs in the context of something else's needs.
You're becoming kind of a surrogate mom and dad for these animals, right? And they become dependent on you. That's something new. The wild animals aren't. You have to know about the reproduction and how they care for their young, because if the mother rejects the baby sheep, you have to take over, or else the sheep has to be killed. So I know my uncle, they had always some sheep that the mother didn't want, and they had to either help them find another mother, or they had to feed them with a bottle. And so they took over the role of the mother. But they're also taking the role of the leader of the pack as well. The one, if you're herding, you are taking on the dominant male role in a herd of animals as well. So you're both doing, alpha male and mother figure for these animals, which is very different. Yeah.
It's surprising that at one time you are a protector and a mother, and you want to nurture the animal, and at other times you want to slaughter and get the meat out of it.
Yeah, so that's also going to be a shift in, up until that point, you weren't nurturing them. So you could respect them and say, thank you for giving your life for my thing. But now you're actually taking care of them. Your children are playing with them. And you still have to then slaughter them and use them for food. So that creates a different kind of psychology around animals and the relationship to humans. But also just physically then, what about this idea of milk? Most of these animals, the first animals were domesticated for their milk. That's something brand new. You didn't milk wild animals as they're running across the plains, right? So milk is a high protein food, and then could replace a lot of other things. It could replace meat. You could have a more vegetarian lifestyle in some ways, because you wouldn't have to kill the animals. There are many herds people who very rarely kill the animals. They milk them. They even bleed them, but they don't kill them.
Affects reproduction cycles of humans too, because mothers can wean their children faster.
Because they have other kinds of milk, So a lot of things come about just because of this idea of milking. Yeah.
Yes, and the thing that I was talking about, it just brought to my mind that it actually brings a lot of respect for the animal, and then we just don't get wild into just killing them. You respect them for their life, and you know that whatever I'm taking, I will just take as much as I need, and I will not damage their survival. I will need it, and I will take respectfully. Like farmers usually try their best. They will kill only the animal that they're sure has lived enough and not going to breed, or they're old, and they would usually just pick that animal and they say, okay, that animal is not going to live for long anyways.
In my ancestral home in Norway, the sheep actually lived better than the humans. But because of that, because the sheep it was more important that the sheep got the grain and things like that. They got the best grain, they got the best of everything. But milk products then also gave a huge amount of more variety to the food in the human diet. But milk has some problems. Milk spoils. So new skills around making yogurt, making cheese, butter, making ways to preserve milk products was a whole new set of skills in the human community that only could come about through this new relationship. So every time your children, drink some milk, that could be the opportunity to really think about milk has kind of a bad rap these days, sort of with all these lactose intolerant people and everything. But really, it was a very important aspect of human development, was this notion that we could milk animals and then preserve their lives, continue to it. Then what about clothing? The domestication of animals, what did that do in terms of our clothing?
Wool.
Right, now we could take fibers from the animal without skinning it. We didn't have to kill it. We could just take the fibers, but then what are we going to do with them? You have to learn to spin, you have to learn to weave, you might have to learn to sew, and that's exactly on our timeline of early human beings. All that's happening at the same time. Now, probably human beings wove things like grasses and things before that, but then they had to take that knowledge and say, we could do it with palm fronds, and here's this mass of wool, what could we do with that? Maybe we can do the same thing, but that's quite a leap of imagination.
Even the tools how would you even go about?
How would you know to think of a loom or a spinning, a spindle?
Or shears,
Or,
to take off the...
So those are some interesting stories about the fact that this new relationship with animals also brought with it the development of new kinds of clothing. Around this same time, pottery was being developed in many places in the world. So what does that all have? What's that got to do with the whole thing?
Because now you're storing food.
You're storing things. You're more sedentary. You might have to winter over things. You need to store. And you can make larger vessels because you don't have to carry them. So you're going to look for materials that are maybe more durable, that are, and that can be bigger. And all over the world around this time, pottery was being developed. But then human beings being how they are, they didn't just make pots, they decorated them and they did all sorts of beautiful things, and they tried out different shapes and they tried out different firing techniques. And also, where were they getting the raw materials? What do you use to make pottery? Clay. Where do you get clay? Round by what? Water, rivers, right? So then you're starting to get this idea that villages might start to grow up around Rivers, because they're sources of fresh water, they're sources of clay. You can, there's growth happening there. You can maybe harvest seeds. And eventually, then people in this living more sedentary lives are also, you said about feeding the animals. What are you going to do? You know, the animals can't go to new pastures. They're stuck with you. They're dependent on you. You've got to have something to feed them. So you either have to, you know, gather things, or you have to start growing things. So maybe, and we don't know whether or not the agriculture also came as its own response, or whether it came as actually the response of these animals that we've got. It's all happening kind of around the same time. And it's all happening because people are stuck at a place and can't just pick up and leave. And then all of the things they're making make it even more difficult. They're making bigger structures, housing, because now they're stuck in a place. They can't move. It's winter. What kind of structure do you need? Now you're going to need maybe some more permanent type structures that are more insulated. So you're going to change your building techniques. So all of that could happen just by the thing of having animals to take care of. So we're going to take a little bit of a break, and then we're going to look a little bit more at agriculture. So we'll take 15 minutes and then reconvene about what might have happened in those time periods. So you don't need to feel like, oh, you're going to have to read all these books to be able to do this, because the pictures are on your timeline of early human beings. If you go back to that, you'll see where the stories can just sort of be lifted off of that timeline work. And then you help the children to build in the same way that you will. Okay, if they're staying in one place, what do they have to worry about? If they're doing this, what do they have to worry about? What do they have to solve? How do they have to go about it? And you'll find that the children come up with a lot of the same things that you just did in your groups. One thing we didn't talk about was health. We talked about a little bit of the health of the animals, but what about people? When they're living in settled communities.
The more people there are, the more germs there are.
Right. This would have been a very big challenge, and waste products of humans. You're now basically eating and shitting in the same place. You don't have to film that part. I guess you did. Anyway. So you've got to deal with the idea, with the challenges of disease, communicable diseases, which are not as prevalent in hunter-gatherer communities as they are in settled communities, and where people are going to dispose of food waste and human waste. Because you're not moving on. So those are also some new challenges in the more sedentary lifestyle. And then since you have all of these new things like milking, and you have weaving, and you have pottery making, what also might that start to foster? It might start to foster some specialization, which maybe wasn't the case before, where everybody just sort of had to pitch in. Now you could say some people could really become better weavers than others. Some people could take care of the herding. And although probably everybody had to do a little bit of everything else, there could be starting to be a different kind of division of labor. So you have the beginnings in these settled communities of specialization. And then one other thing that we want to think about in terms of our children now is when we were hunter-gatherers, what kind of hand-eye coordination did we have to have?
Good.
Extremely good. Well, so that means that learning to coordinate your hand and your eye, and especially fine motor coordination, is hardwired into us in the first 6 years of our lives. So why is everybody complaining over the fact that children are not coordinated and have such poor motor skills? Whose fault is that? Yeah. Apple. Yes. Right? It is not necessary for our children to be so poorly coordinated, but they've got to actually have things to do with their hands at an early age. And it's not just this, yeah, or this. Plus they'll all end up with tendinitis by the age of 7, you know, so, and back problems by the age of 10 if they continue in the way that they're doing. So that whole body coordination has never been more important than it is now, because not because we're Luddites who don't want to use technology, but because we have to do it. We have to establish that early on, because it's part of our psyche also. It's part of our feeling of self-worth is connected to our coordination. It's how we, for 100,000 of years, contributed to the society that we lived in through the work of our hands. So here's just a little map about the spread of domestication of animals and plants. We think that it happened in that area of the Fertile Crescent, that sheep were probably the earliest domesticated animals for food and things, and then goats as well. And it's spread out often by the rivers. And one of the things that people do say about the New World societies, because there were now people in the New World, is that one of the problems that they encountered was that the animals there were not so amenable to domestication. Sheep, for some reason, and goats allowed themselves to be domesticated more than the animals of the New World. And so that's partially the part of the situation why the old world societies seem to be a little bit earlier in their development of a number of these things. So they're living, they have to take care of the animals, they're starting to plant some seeds because they have to have a winter store of food. And then one of the things that people start to discover is that now you've got this high protein diet with milk, you've got lots and lots of grain. So what's going to happen to your infant mortality? It's going to go down. And more children are going to grow to adulthood, and your population is going to increase, which then puts pressure on finding out better ways of growing food. So it becomes a kind of a self-perpetuating cycle. You grow some food, your children survive, then they grow up and they've got some appetites, and then you've got to feed them, and so then it all keeps going around and around. The populations are growing, so agriculture has to become intensified. So it's no longer good enough to just harvest some seeds and plant them in your kitchen garden behind your house. You got to have some fields now, and not just a garden. So what kinds of new challenges does that bring? Especially the challenge of how are you going to get the water to the fields? Now, fresh water, what do we know about water from our 3 states of matter? What do the children know about water? It flows down. So it's always going down into the hollows. If they get a chance to go to the river, a river nearby or a creek, there's always a bank down. It's not floating up on the top, right? It's down. So here's our poor humans, you know, they need to plant lots and lots of seeds, and the water is down there, so they're going to have to figure out a way to get the water from down there to up in the fields. So that's one of the inventions. That's a very early invention called the shaduf from ancient Egypt, which then used the idea of a kind of a lever to get the water and put it into a canal, which would bring it to the fields. So suddenly, a new challenge really is irrigation. How do you get the water to the plants now? And then what were people using to plant the seeds with? They were digging sticks. They were just poking holes in the ground and putting the seeds in. Okay, that's fine. You got a kitchen garden, you got the time, make some holes. But you want a field, then you're going to need to use your imagination and think, how can we make this stick do better work for us? So what did they do? They started to attach a handle to it. The first things that drew those first plows, that was people, right? So the people were then now putting the stick on a handle and dragging it instead of poking. So they were getting rows of holes. And then as the animals became able to be beasts of burden, then you could harness your plow to the animals and they could start to do some work with you. And then by the time metal came, and people started using bronze and then later iron, then the plows kind of took off. And that is a very interesting exploration for the children, is the story of the plow and how it changed over time and is now very much different, but still the same principle. You got to dig a hole, and then the newest thing that came about around, I think, 1700s maybe, was that the idea of turning the soil to get organic matter down into the soil to help the soil regenerate, because as people did till the soil, what did they start to find out? That the soil would be depleted of its nutrients after a while, and then they would be either forced to move on or forced to think of some way of giving nutrients back to the soil. So this is again another new set of soil management. How do you manage to keep soil fruitful? Now the people in Egypt, they had it pretty easy because the Nile did that for them. The Nile just flooded and brought silt and renewed the land pretty much every year. But in Mesopotamia, it was a big problem. And the reason that Mesopotamia is largely desert now may have partially to do with the fact that the agriculture that did happen there, over time, salt builds up in the soil. Even fresh water has a little bit of salt, so when the water is evaporating, the salt stays, and eventually the land becomes arid and depleted, and they were not able to replenish it. In Europe, there was many forests. So as people were moving into Europe, what did they do? They used slash and burn. They cut the trees down, planted, and then did move on sometimes when the soil was depleted. And that's still happening in South America now, in the rainforest area. Yes?
I'm just curious too, like I think a pretty big thing that plays into this, and I'm interested to know when it's first documented, but also like slavery is a huge piece of that with agricultural and historical buildings and societies too.
Okay, so let's think about that with regards to the subjugation of other peoples. Would that really be necessary in a hunter-gatherer situation? It might. You know, you might conquer somebody and their people might become your slaves. Not as common. When people are having small agricultural settlements, small village settlements, not really so important either because the fields are small. But what did start to happen is that these settlements started making walls around them of various kinds, palisades of wood or stone walls. So what's that all about?
Protect from others.
Yeah. Raiding. You put all this investment into your animals, into your plants, and somebody could just come along in the night and take them. And there were still many hunter-gatherers around, raiding parties, so there was a lot of tension between some of these settlements and their and the nomadic tribes around. So then, if your community gets larger and your walls get bigger, then sometimes you start to need a workforce that isn't just part-time. Yeah. And you get a stratification in the society.
I think it's interesting too to think about how our relationship to God or our idea of like the holy changes as agriculture becomes the mainstay.
Okay, good. We haven't talked about that, but when a lot of tribal religion in hunter-gatherer societies is often based on the spirit world, and that spirits could be everywhere, and then they might take up residence in a tree or a rock or a cave or something. But when people become settled, then their idea of what needs to be worshipped also is going to change, because what are they really dependent on? They're dependent on rain. They're dependent on the cycles of the sun in a way that they may have never done before. And so you start to see the first astronomical sun calendars around the same time as the beginnings of agriculture. You get the megaliths being built, people using their whole lives to carry stone to build a megalith, to be able to calculate the equinoxes and the solstices, because the sun year becomes much more important than ever before and starts to, in a way, compete with the lunar year. The lunar year was always important for peoples, but the lunar year and the solar year start to kind of be in a competition for people's attention at a certain point. So you have people like, I think the Aztecs that use both lunar and solar calendars. And that becomes very interesting. Then you come back into the other history work that you did last summer with time and our measurements of time and how those change because of our new needs to measure. Also, if you've got fields, you've got boundaries, you've got my fields and your fields, so you're going to start measuring land in a way that you may never have done before. So in these agriculture societies, you're starting to then get a different kind of territorialism. And at the same time, the food production is getting greater and greater. The populations are getting greater and greater. And the gods start to become, in a way, more powerful, because they have a very strong effect, and then you have to appease them to make sure that your harvest will grow. So often now you start to get temples being built where you may never have had that before. And you have a whole class of people then that have to take care of this temple. And they're the ones also that tell you, what does the god need to be happy? And in what they call these divine households, the priests also then have a huge amount of land, and they have a lot of money, and they start to pay the people who are the best weavers, the best craftsmen, to be able to start making a beautiful environment for the resident god. So now we're into city building.
So, question.
Yes.
When does money sort of?
Money's still not happening yet.
Okay.
Still
It's
pretty
not
much barter, but it's starting to be used, but mostly it would be done in forms of goods.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
But maybe the
I wanted to
IOU.
clarify, so we're saying that there's a direct connection between city building and these divine households?
Yes. And the divine household of the temple and its, because what do you need, what starts to really happen? Here's just not a very good map on there, but of this spread of agriculture, often from these river civilizations. Oh, and one other thing about this, in this transition then, with village life, is that you have the possibility of making bigger tools, right? Because you don't have to carry them off, so they could be bigger, and they could be heavier, and they, you get the things that people can just have around. You have grinding stones. You start to have ovens, permanent food things. So your food preparation starts to change as well. And some historians start to say about around the time of the village that one of the things also in the social structure that starts to change is that people have to become more, shift from just kinship to neighborliness, to solidarity with one's neighbors, not necessarily one's kin. And this becomes very interesting because now you're having to create customs of neighborliness, like shaking of the hand. Something about people who are not really known to you in the same way. And you're also going to then get a rise of gossip because you got neighbors, you got somebody to talk about, right? And that the rituals of customs start to develop, kind of spiraling out of this idea that now people, larger groups of people, maybe you don't know them as well as you used to. You still have to get along. And if you're threatened, you all may have to go inside this palisade or this wall and get along very well for short periods of time. You might have to band together to defend a territory. But then when the danger is over, you might get back to squabbling and gossiping about each other and, shifting your boundary. No, my field starts here and your field stops there. So that's one of the interesting social things then about village life. As populations grow, one has to develop new strategies of dealing with people who are more strangers to you than before, but still not yet total strangers. But what happens when the population gets even bigger? Then you have a lot of strangers. Here's just a picture of, this is from America, with a reconstruction of this notion of the village with the wall around it. So around the big river systems, you're starting to get this kind of expanded village, usually walled in some form, with people living outside the walls who then have to come inside the walls for protection. You often get, because of the rivers, you have to have then a whole group of people who take care of trade. It's no longer all personal. I scratch my back, you scratch your back. Or no, I scratch your back, you scratch my back. You're going to be developing a class of merchants whose whole job is the I scratch your back, you scratch my back. Between people, the middlemen start to grow as a class. And they're more mobile, some of them, because they might have the boats. And they might travel away and come back. And what are they going to come back with that's not just goods? Culture, stories, ideas. The temple that rose to the sky. And the people in the city, they just have to decide that, we're just going to trust this story, because they have no way of really confirming it. That's a little bit like now. You can't hardly confirm anything on the news anymore. But back then, quite difficult, because you couldn't yourself figure out what was really going on. So these people who were the mobile ones, coming out, coming back, coming with tales, coming with goods, maybe goods you've never seen before in your whole life. It became a very exciting time for life in the cities. But there are a lot of strangers that have to live together. So who's going to be the boss? Someone's going to fill that role, right? And in those early cities, certain powerful families accumulated enough wealth, and then the priests and their divine households. So then, as the cities grew, those people taking care of the spiritual needs of the people with regards to the gods, and then the people who were taking care of the commerce part of it, they had to have some sort of strange cooperation, which we now maybe call corruption, but this was all new. The stratification of human society, the pyramid building of you have a lot of people at the bottom and a few people at the top, this was completely new. So what kinds of new skills, this is your group question then, for those first city dwellers, what kinds of challenges now? Got a lot of strangers, not everybody's involved in food production, jobs are now kind of spread all around. Somebody's got to make sure that those walls are still intact. So you've got some very big challenges. So take a few minutes and think about those and what kinds of new skills human beings then had to turn their tendencies towards developing.
What's going on with the whispering?
First thing is that specialization.
You're helping work. But this is when we do development. Yeah.
And you get more specialization in jobs. You get social structure.
Your group back there.
Our group?
Yes.
So we talked about the continuous specialization of jobs and that allowing for greater development and kind of like in anything, right? You have more time if you are not worried about feeding yourself because somebody else has that job. Maybe you are developing new forms of, like you use weaving as an example or pottery making, and you have the ability.
So what tendency? Our tendency for self-perfection.
Yeah, self-perfection. Well, an expression.
It's fed in a new way.
Right.
Because we have maybe some time to really think about that. Excellent. Yeah. And?
We talked about the need to communicate changing with trade, so the development of alphabets, numbers, and transportation having to evolve really quickly, traveling greater distances and what you're transporting changing. We talked about kind of social structures being different and the need for kind of power and laws and somebody who's executing all of that over another group of people.
Okay, let's think about that idea of law and order. Was there law and order in a hunter-gatherer society? Oh yeah. Right? But did they need laws? Probably not. They didn't have a police. You know, who was gonna, if they did, I mean, they had laws, but they would then be those unspoken laws. But you got a community of strangers. The unspoken law doesn't cut it anymore, right? Because everybody doesn't know how they're supposed to act. So you're going to start getting laws written down. In order to write down laws, you're going to have a written communication form as well. Or you're going to have to proclaim laws, and you're going to have then somebody who might have their own the job of policing, or and then you might have to, what do you do with people who are law breakers? Are you going to have prisons? Are you going to cut off their hands? Or if you in the first round of things, if you're not going to have prisons and you want to punish people, what was often the most, some sort of maiming, yeah, or marking. of someone to say, this is a bad human, stay clear of this person, they've committed this crime, and you were stigmatized in that way physically, so that it was very obvious to everyone who you were. Because that, again, in a community of people who may be more or less strangers to each other, then certain forms then of marking who you are, whether it's through your clothing, through your hairstyles, the various aspects of status, and making visual status statements. Not that it didn't happen in hunter-gatherer societies, but it's a little bit hard when you look at, say, who's the chief, because they might just look like anybody else, except for when they don maybe some ritual regalia. But it can be pretty easy to see who's a king in these things, or who are the wealthy, or who are the priests. And all of these, different kinds of robes. And if we think about the Phoenicians and that purple dye that they traded with, if people didn't care about status, then that dye would not have had any value. But they had to care enough to pay the price for this purple dye made out of this secretion from the sea animal. So these things all kind of hang together in these increasing webs of how people who then don't know each other somehow try to make a society work. You need completely different kinds of systems. You can't rely on gossip. I mean, gossip is a very strong social control agent, don't you think? In Norway, they say that there's the unspoken law of, because Norwegian society up until very recently was very agricultural and village-based. So gossip was the major form of social control, and it was always, there was something called janteloven, which means it's the law of jante. And the 11th law, there was 10 commandments, but the 11th one was the most devastating. It was, don't think we don't know something about you. And that is the power of gossip in small societies, which is why some people escape now to cities, because they want to escape that. But then you end up with the problem of isolation in cities, and how do you deal with the fact that we are social beings. So what happens in those early cities is you have these stratifications of society, and then how do you create solidarity then? How do you make people not just be caring about their level of society? What can bring people together? Religion, festivals. Boy, they had a lot of festivals in those days. Every time there's a festival, then maybe it's only an illusion, but people feel that we are one. Yeah? We all are celebrating the same festival, the same time every year. We have the same rituals. We all feel connected. And then the other thing that tended to bring people together was threat. Okay, how different is this now? Not so different now. But people tend to come together when there's a threat. So then armies, and the notion of then city-states, that our city is our state, and it is almost like a country that we have to defend. So do hunter-gatherers make good armies? Not so much. And village people, village pastoralists village agriculturalists do not make good armies, because they don't want to leave their fields. Now, the people who made good armies were two types. The cities could make good armies because they could recruit people, and then the pastoralists, because they were already mobile, some of them, the herders. And they were used to, especially once they got horses tamed, then they became a force to be reckoned with, as certain weaponry, being able to shoot a bow from a horseback, for example. So there became two parallel kinds of developments of armies at this time. You have the nomadic-ish kind of pastoralist armies, and then you have the city armies. And basically the village people are kind of caught in the middle of the whole thing. I heard somebody mention waste. Is that a big problem in cities? Is it a big problem now? Anybody who saw the pictures from Naples when the garbage people went on strike a couple of years ago, that infrastructure in terms of waste was a huge aspect of development in the cities. Those cities that were successful at managing waste and bringing water into the city, clean water in, mucky water out. They were able to control disease better, and they were able to bring, have hygiene and other things. One of the most successful cities was in India, or now Pakistan, but around the Indus River. They were masters at sewage systems. They were masters at making mud brick sewage systems. They had indoor bathrooms and things so that every house had clean water and was able to get rid of waste. They had other problems which ended up leading to their fall, which is kind of an interesting story for the children. But at least in terms of waste management, they were really on top of the game.
What people were
this is the Harappan civilization of the Indus Valley. Temple building became then, and temple management. The Sumerians and the Babylonians became really masters of that, and the Egyptians then kind of copied them and took it even further. But so that the temple as the divine household where the god must be placated, but also because the temple, whoops, sorry, I didn't realize that I was not on there. There we go, the temple. And that was the city, that's a reconstruction of what they thought the city of Mohenjo-Daro looked like. The priests were amassing great wealth, and they hired craftsmen. So there was this notion of our spiritual needs driving economy. And also then, because of having to have that burden of responsibility of having to know what the gods wanted, then the priests also had to become astronomers and learn to read entrails of animals, divination of various kinds, in order to try to communicate the will of the gods. Every city usually had a major god that was in residence there, even though there might be other gods also worshipped. And they were also often the most imposing structures of the cities. Now, it's not coincidence then that around 600 BC, So after cities had been growing and these temples are being built in Egypt and in the Mesopotamian area, in China, around 600 BC, some very interesting things happened in the field of religion. Anybody have an idea of what was going on around then? Around 600 BC. That had already been sort of happening, but also you had Buddha, you had Zoroaster, and you had the guy, I can never say his name, the Jain guy in India, all being major reform movements reacting against this amass of wealth and pomp in the temples. All of these religions, Zoroastrianism in Persia and Buddhism, all had this notion of asceticism, of not being concerned with wealth, and even this notion that the God is not somebody to just be pleased, that there's some sort of force that is different than this God in residence. And then another thing that we don't always think about, and the children certainly don't think about, that before there were roads, there were no roads. You really didn't have roads when we lived in villages. So when did roads start being built? And what else did you need to make a road worthwhile? You need wheeled vehicles. Wheeled vehicles need roads, and roads help wheeled vehicles. So when did the wheel start getting used? Around 3000 BC perhaps, maybe a little before. First without spokes, later with spokes. Then came like chariots and things. So the building up of the wheeled vehicle then also said, all right, we got wheels, we got wheeled vehicles, but driving a wheeled vehicle over just terrain doesn't often get you faster to where you want to go. So then you've got to sort of create something that the vehicles can travel on. And you have this huge amount of road building, I think around 2000 BC or so, and especially the Romans are some of the most famous. They built roads everywhere. Right? It is not really that, the expression all roads lead to Rome was not really facetious. It really, every time they conquered a place, it was important. The first thing that was important was to build a road to Rome. And the same thing was true in the Incan civilization. The minute they conquered a place, they built a road back to the capital because they needed to send their governors back and forth and their messengers. So all the way until the Middle Ages in Europe, I mean, things don't really change that much in terms of city life. Still the same problems. Still the wall, still the temple in the middle, or the cathedral. Still the stratification of the society. You do start having more money because people are even dealing with more strangers. But it's not really, sorry, Norwegian, forgot to translate that. Ships in the Renaissance, okay? So some of you had talked about transportation. The sailing vessel came quite early. But a lot of times the sailing ships traveled mostly along coasts. not across big seas. You started to get some in the Viking period where you start getting ships that are able to travel far across the seas. But really then shipbuilding really took off in the Renaissance times, and that increases then the webs that human beings then are involved in and the kind of dependencies then, because now goods can be transported, people can be transported, exploration can continue. And then we have also then things that happen in the Industrial Revolution. And there's a lot of things that you can talk to the children about the Industrial Revolution, but one thing that even the younger children can understand is that people burn things, right? We burn things for energy, right? Energy is the basis of society. And what did people burn way back? Wood, right? They burned wood. Now, wood, how has wood gotten its energy? Over how long of time? Yeah. However long that tree has grown. Maybe up to a couple hundred years, sometimes longer. So then human beings find something else to burn. Coal. How long did it take for coal to gather its energy? Eons, yeah? So more efficient use of burning, right? Now human beings have always used wind, water, these so-called renewable sources of energy. But they were a little unpredictable sometimes, right? Wasn't always blowing, or the water wasn't always flowing. So the fossil fuels started to give human beings an enormous amount of energy. Coal being one of them, and peat, turf, being another. Also something that builds up over millions of years. And England had a lot of peat, a lot of coal, and a lot of iron. And a lot of people wonder why England was sort of that radiating center of the Industrial Revolution. And a lot of it has to do with just this amount, the amount of energy you could harness from the earth. And now, then, what do we have now? Of gas and oil. Huh? Yeah. That's like the most concentrated, because then you're talking about the energy that was generated at the Big Bang. So we're talking real energy there. The energy that it took to just fuse the atom. So it is a lot about energy, but at the same time, what are we also looking at now? How to make our renewable ones more efficient, more reliable, and harnessing. So we're now having all of the benefit of all that exploration into burning stuff. And now we have to think about, okay, what's the most responsible way to do this? Did anybody ever in the history of the earth have to think about that? Not so much. I mean, yes, the beginning cities did have to, you burn something, you burn up all your trees, your civilization goes under. And a lot of civilizations went under because they used up all their trees. And they had no other source of energy, so that was that for them. Easter Island, for example, the Viking settlements on Greenland. A lot of places went under just because that they had, the only thing that they knew how to burn was trees. And when the trees got used up, there was nothing left. So we've always had this problem of how to renew the resources, but now we have it on an unprecedented scale because we have this global economy. So the children are facing really important challenges in the future. because we also are living in this, what is the global economy? It's like this giant city full of strangers that you're supposed to care about. Yeah? That's a big job to care about all of these people that you don't know. Right? So we're really stretching the limits of our human potential. Montessori believed it was possible. And through your storytelling, if you can connect the children to their humanity all the way back to the beginning, there's a chance that you can build up that compassion. There really is. Okay. So when we want to do some storytelling for the children, we really do want to constantly bring the tendencies to the children that human beings cannot not think, build, measure, express ourselves, talk about it, and that drives us forward constantly. We always use movement and exploration, and even though the need isn't as obvious to our children today, that's partly our problem, isn't it? That their daily need doesn't say, oh, you've got to get creative to survive. But the need of the world, the sustainability of the human race, the sustainability of the world requires even more creativity than ever before. So also then when you're talking about people, because sometimes we do know the people. A lot of times when we're talking about the ancient inventions, we don't know the people who invented them, but sometimes we do. So there's a few tips about that when you're doing a biography story, and most of those are in a document that I gave you called Biography, which is, it's both the process you need to go through when you are going to tell a story about a person, but it's also the process we want the children to go through. So if you go through it, then you'll have compassion for their struggle to have a biography story that isn't, the person was born, they did some stuff, and then they died. So you want to really think about bringing to life the dilemmas, the conflicts, what caused that person to become so creative that they made a difference. And interestingly enough, often we find that they didn't have very good childhoods. Okay, now isn't that kind of an important message to a lot of our children, that it really doesn't matter. You got some stuff thrown at you when you were little, but you are a human being. You are robust, you are strong, and you can make anything into a strength. They often had terrible economic hardship, these people. They had to overcome that. Is that a good message for our children to hear about? Absolutely. Some of them were not believed or not accepted, not made famous. They didn't get any likes on Facebook. They got the opposite. There's some guy who writes books about sort of the necessary obstacles, that you have to have necessary obstacles that sometimes get your curmudgeonliness back up and say, all right, I don't care what you think. I'm going to try anyway. Is that a good message for our children? Absolutely, because so many of them just think, well, I just want to be like everybody else. I'm not going to stand up for something because it's too hard and nobody likes me and I'm going to eat worms. And it all comes down to that idea of never giving up. That there is a driving force in human beings that we don't give up. If we did, we'd be gone. And yet, we're not gone yet. So, you have an assignment to write a little book of an invention story. So in order to make, and this book has two functions in your classroom. One, if you write a little book, what does that tell your children about things that they can do in the class? I can write a little book. You can't bring these books into class and say, oh, you can write a book, because they're looking at those and going, no, I can't. Right? But if you have a book, 8 to 10 pages, one little paragraph on each page, and you say to the children, I wrote this book, right? And especially if you do hand drawings to it, then it's very impressive. But at least the fact that you have written a little book suddenly says to the children, oh, that's also a book. It's not just all of these things with amazing illustrations and things. It can be something simple, something small, because what you want to do is focus on one little invention and then take it back through time to where it did not exist, set the scene, and help the children somehow see the importance of that invention. You don't have to take it through all of its steps to the modern age, right? But you definitely have to set the scene of when there were no bridges, right? When there was no, Smartphone. But try to think of things that are also a little bit more common even. You know, not necessarily the technological gadgets we have now, because those have such a short history, but really think about a spoon, right? Or, I mean, because or a fork. You know, forks have a history. Or in Norway we use a particular kind of cheese slicer that slices very thin cheeses. And it was invented by a guy who, I mean, Norway was a very poor country. We had a lot of milk products, but it was very important not to cut thick slices of cheese because everybody was too poor. So you had to make the cheese last. So he was a carpenter, and he was looking at planers that shaved wood, and he says, I'll make one of those for cheese. So he did, and then it became our cheese slicer. So now, even though Norway is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, we all just make these very thin slices of cheese still. Yes? I don't remember the name. I don't remember even what it's. I'll find out, because one of my Norwegian students wrote a story about him. It was very good. Anyway, so your book, you want to really establish for the children what it was like before the thing that you're talking about happened. And then you want to think about, also maybe you might want to start your book with something the children know about the thing that happened. What they use it for now. Then you're going to go back in time to the time before it happened and really focus on the dilemma and the challenges of whoever, and it doesn't have to be a known inventor. And then focus on a few of the struggles that were involved, a few of the major milestones, but you don't need to do a full timeline. We looked at a book, I think last summer, about cotton, perhaps. Showed you a little book that I wrote about cotton. I think it's on the web, on the Schoology, but I'll put it up so you can see a little book that you can get some ideas from. Yeah. Ah. Okay. So that's your one assignment.
Just a quick question. Is this going to be available?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes. No, 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 no. Okay, so, I mean, it could be something like, you know, thinking about staying cool, you know? Like, what did people do before there was air conditioning? Going back. So this isn't a great story, but it's a first draft of some things that could be woven into a little book about staying cool and some of the interesting things that people did way back when. You know, just tossing you have a mud brick house, so you sort of spray water all over the place and you let it evaporate and it cools you down. Not bad. And here's also some of the things that you've all talked about in your groups that you might want to choose for your invention. You may not want to choose an ancient invention. You can choose something that's modern, but there are some things like this. And then there's some tips about, you also have to write a little oral biographical story, and I just want you to read through the document on biography to get some ideas about things. And the major thing about a biography story is don't start when they were born, unless it's really, really important for the story. Start with jump into the story at some important point. Because if the children want to know, well, when was he born? They'll find out. Okay. So, between now and 1 o'clock, you can start giving yourself, you know, do some little bit of research if you want to sort of get your self-oriented in terms of your stories. Choose a person, choose an invention. And then I need you to do one observation exercise before you come back after lunch at 1 o'clock that we'll be using. I need you to go outside and take a 5 to 10 minute walk around and write down any sensory impressions you have about the garden. And you'll need to really look closely because it doesn't look like there's happening very much. Sounds, things that you see, things that you might smell, whatever it takes, just brainstorm some impressions that you need to come back to at 1 o'clock, with at 1 o'clock, which we'll be using for some poetry work.
And just so you